Do you ever look at old boats and think, how did that even work? Well, wonder no more, because today we will be diving into 17 boat innovations. Some of them endured with time, while others were just quick ideas that ended their days like the Titanic. Some of them were genius, some were bizarre, and some sunk for a reason. So if you love boats and technology, or are just in search of some laughable ideas, you are at the right spot. And if there's one thing guaranteed in today's video, it's that you'll be very grateful for GPS. Speaking of getting lost, don't forget to subscribe, or you might just end up navigating with a sextant and a soggy paper map. Let's start with the first category of today's video, steering and control systems, more accurately with old wooden helms. Just picture an old pirate ship. The waters are stormy and the captain is holding the massive wooden helm, shouting at the top of his lungs while keeping the helm from spinning. Sadly, these iconic big wooden helms are almost extinct. In old times, people needed these oversized wooden helms because they connected the rudders through a complicated system of ropes and pulleys. The bigger the ship, the bigger the wheel had to be to generate enough leverage to steer. But let's be real, as cool as these wooden helms were, steering a massive wheel was essentially the maritime equivalent of driving an 18-wheeler without power steering. And today we can hardly find these once so popular wheels. With the advancement of technology, a captain can precisely steer a huge cruiser with relatively small controls and minimal effort. Mostly buttons and levers will do the trick. Of course, today we can still find the historic wooden helms, but they are definitely not used for practical purposes. On the other hand, they are used for nostalgia's sake, tourist attractions, or historic replicas. It was somewhere in the mid-20th century that people decided that boats could use some more of a modern touch, some luxury that cars had, and it was right then that the idea of putting a car steering wheel onto a boat came to life. The logic seems sound, doesn't it? Cars had and still have smaller, stylish, and more luxurious steering wheels than the big pirate-looking wooden ones we could find on boats. Well, that idea didn't float for a long time, because cars and boats don't steer in the same way. In a car, as we all know, the tires turn directly in response to the steering wheel, while on boats, the outboard motor shifts in the water, which reacts differently depending on currents, speeds, and hull design as well. So, using a tiny car-like wheel on a boat means a lot less leverage and way more effort when making turns. It could be comparable to parallel parking, which is already hard, but now put it on water, with no brakes and currents pushing you into a dock. Easy peasy, right? And then apart from the difficulty of using such a wheel, the materials used in cars cannot be used on boats because of the sun, salt water, and moisture, which makes it quickly wear down. Eventually, pretty quickly, boat manufacturers went back to marine steering wheels, which are bigger, sturdier, and designed to endure the rough sea conditions. Today, finding such an oddity can only mean two things: that someone was either too creative with their DIY modifications, or a joke that didn't make many people laugh. But of course, people also switch it around for some laughs. Did you ever see one of these vessels in the open waters? Let us know in the comments below. If you've ever watched an old movie where the captain dramatically shouts "full speed ahead" while yanking a brass lever, you've seen an engine order telegraph, EOT, in action. Before modern throttle controls, ship bridges and engine rooms had no direct connection, so the EOT acted as a middleman. The captain or officer at the bridge would place the lever to signify the command, say slow ahead or full astern, and the engineers in the engine room had to manually adjust the speed of the engine. If you thought waiting for your texting mate to reply was frustrating enough, just imagine being inside a storm and hoping that the message reaches the engine room in time. When the ship started getting more and more automated, it was easier to use a direct electronic throttle control instead of an EOT. Modern-day captains can change speed instantaneously just by pushing a button or turning a dial. Forget hoping that the engine crew was paying attention or misinterpreting a command at a critical moment. Though you'll still find old telegraphs in some vintage ships and museums, their days of real use are long gone. And honestly, we are better off. Just imagine taking a relaxing cruising boat through the Caribbeans, and every hour the captain shouts his lungs out. Probably not as enjoyable as it could be. The next category in today's video is going to be navigation. We've seen the evolution of the steering wheel, but how did the navigation system change with time? Let's talk about the sextant first, and how it got replaced by the well-known GPS. Just imagine being in the middle of the ocean, surrounded only by water, with no land on the horizon, and having to figure out exactly where you are by looking at the stars. That's exactly what the sextant did. This unique tool was used by sailors all over the world to measure the angle between the horizon and the celestial bodies above. But it wasn't a tool for everyone, because using one of these required skills, math, and most importantly a crystal clear sky. Now you can probably understand why GPS was such a revolution. Instead of squinting at the clouds in the hope of seeing a planet or two, you can just take a look at the screen that tells you your exact location, speed, direction, and more. This invention definitely made life on the sea easier, faster, and more efficient in general. I don't know about you, but I would leave stargazing as a way into someone's heart on Valentine's, and not a way out of a storm in the Atlantic. But on the other hand, love sometimes does feel as tumultuous. But let's take another step back and take a look at the RDF, the radio direction finder used before the GPS. This machine worked by detecting radio signals from known stations in order to figure out your exact location. The idea behind it was simple. You just had to find the direction of two or more signals, draw lines on a chart, and where they intersected is where you were located. This way of locating was super easy. The only problem was that the RDF required strong, clear signals without any interference. But of course, they were as delicate as bringing up politics on Christmas dinner is. Literally anything could throw them off. Weather, terrain, or even other ships. They quickly became as useful as an old AM radio in the era of Spotify. You do the math now. And now we finally made our way to the first GPS, the Loran-C. Loran-C was that almost GPS, used before actual satellites took over the game. This contraption worked similarly to the RDF, but way more accurately. It was reliable over long distances, but the moment GPS stepped in, even the Loran-C felt outdated. It was officially shut down, without even considering it for a backup plan in case of GPS failure. Today it remains just a footnote in navigation history, remembered only by old-school sailors and historians. Do you remember them, or did you ever use them? Let us know in the comments below. Did you ever wonder how they measured the depth of the sea back in the day? Well, wonder no more, because we are here to explain it to you. Way before the sonar became a thing, sailors had a lead line, a weighted rope marked with depth measurements that was dropped into the water and let to sink. Yeah, that's pretty much it. They would let the line sink and see how deep it went. Not really high tech, is it? That's why sonar was such a revolution for depth finders. With only a push of a button, we can instantly read the exact water depth, bottom contours, and even fish activity, if you ever want to check out who lives in a pineapple under the sea. Aren't you glad that the lead lines are not a thing anymore? Because I certainly am. And talking about lines, what about speed? Another line, this time a log line. In order to figure out your boat's speed, you would have to throw a log line overboard and count how many knots pass through your hands in a certain time, and that was your speed. This is where the term knots comes from when talking about boat speeds. Again, as soon as the GPS came into the game, this medieval machine disappeared, and can now be found only in museums. For sure you can understand why that is. For our next section, we will talk about Morse code and the handheld foghorns. If you are a person living on this planet and have been exposed to some movies, you surely know what Morse code signaling is. These flashing light systems allowed ships to communicate messages in Morse code when radio technology wasn't yet a thing. The idea is simple. You flash a light in a coded pattern, and another ship or operator would decipher the message. It was a great way to communicate because it was reliable and worked over long distances too. But with radios, satellite communication, and encrypted messaging being implemented, Morse lamps faded into history and are nowadays mostly used for emergencies. Do you know any Morse signals? If so, which ones? Whilst we talk about communication signaling, here's a little sign just reminding you that you can subscribe to our channel and be kind enough to hit the like button. And before the invention of the powerful air horns and electronic warning systems, what did ships rely on? This is when the handheld foghorns were the thing. These rubber bulb horns were used to be squeezed to produce a loud, mournful sound in thick fog. They worked well most of the time, but not all of the time. They weren't loud enough in bad weather, and squeezing one while going through a storm was as effective as whispering into a hurricane. We can't even blame the fact that technology outdated them as easily as it did. Now the air horns can blast a warning that carries for miles, ensuring that even in the toughest weather, the message can be heard. What about surveillance, you might ask? Back in the golden age of sailing, the crow's nest was the ultimate lookout point. That means that perched high on the ship's mast, a sailor would be on the lookout for enemy ships, land, or any kind of danger. But this method, as you saw in many movies, was not the safest option. It was usually cold, windy, and dangerously high up, yet it was the best way to spot trouble for decades. Today, the crow's nest was replaced by radars, high-powered optics, and thermal imaging that do the job way better than Joe Blow did up there. Would you dare to climb up the nest and take on such a responsibility, or do you see yourself down on the deck more? The other object that we will discuss in the section on surveillance is the telescope. As you can imagine, this small tool was one of the most important pieces of equipment used on a ship. Lookouts used these spyglasses to magnify distant objects, which ultimately meant the difference between finding a safe harbor and sailing into trouble. As you can imagine, there are not many instances when the captain would pull out this massive wooden telescope on a trip today, but instead high-powered binoculars are being used. Vintage telescopes remain worthy of admiration, especially because of the craftsmanship and historical significance they hold. But again, they are mostly resting behind glass on museum shelves or as decorations for Halloween costumes. And now let's take a look at the timeless classic Admiral Anchor, a gold standard used by navies and merchant ships alike. For centuries, this style anchor, with its long shank, flukes, and crossbar, was used to dig into the seabed and hold ships in place. They look classy and tattoo-worthy, but they had some down parts as well. They were huge, heavy, difficult to handle, and attracted way too many women when tattooed on your bicep. They worked well on older wooden ships, but with time passing and technology advancing, the vessel started becoming more advanced and more efficient, and so was the need for a better anchor. Today's boats use Danforth and modern claw anchors, which are lighter, more compact, and provide better grip on different seabeds. The more time passes, the more people are becoming obsessed with efficiency, so the newer designs allow for quicker deployment and retrieval, matching this new need we have. But as you know, modernity strips the classic to the bones, leaving them without the soul that made them unique. Are you more of a modernist aficionado or an old-time lover? Did you know that once upon a time, if you wanted to reduce a ship's roll in rough seas, paravanes were what you needed? The paravanes are wing-like devices that were put on either side of a ship to create resistance while being dragged through the water. These intricate sails were especially popular on military and fishing boats, where keeping the deck steady was crucial for operations. But as you can imagine, these big, clunky wings had their downsides, because they required manual setup and drastically slowed ships down due to the drag they created. It wasn't long after that the alternative electronic and hydraulic stabilizers prevailed over the relics of the past. Today we mostly use gyro systems, active fins, and real-time adjustments to keep ships steady without all the hassle. The paravanes are mostly used as a backup. Using them is a real challenge that not every sailor is up to. And now let's take a look at punting poles, the ultimate way to navigate shallow waters. Imagine a boatman standing on the back of a flat-bottomed boat, pushing off the riverbed with a long wooden pole. This was a technique used for decades, if not centuries, in all types of places, especially those with narrow and shallow canals, such as Cambridge, Venice, or rural Vietnam. This method was not only simple, but also required no fuel, which made it a great way to travel. And till this day, we can still find this timeless technique around the world. Of course, with technology advancing, the people advanced with it, and small outboard motors took their place. Who would want to spend hours breaking their back, rowing in small canals when you can just turn the motor on and glide toward the horizon? Motors definitely made water travel accessible to more people without the need for Olympic-level arm strength, or in Vietnam's case, leg strength. Have you ever walked in historic downtown Savannah, Georgia? just taking a relaxing walk when you suddenly spot a big paddle wheel going by. This boat looks like every other boat, but in the back, it has a massive wooden or metal wheel churning through the water, pushing the boat forward, operating instead of a motor. This was the beginning idea for modern-day motors, allowing boats to travel long distances with a steady rhythmic motion. But as you can imagine, these huge hamster wheel-looking motors were not all sunshine and roses. They were bulky, inefficient, very vulnerable to damage, and in case a part of the wheel broke, you weren't going anywhere. Following them were the propellers, and everything changed. These were smaller, faster, and way more efficient motors that also got phased out by the jet propulsion technology. As you can imagine, today you can find this grandpa only in historical cities, museums, or specific river cruises. Next time you are in Savannah, take a look or maybe take a ride on one and let us know how it was. And now let's take a look at our last category of the day, the evolution of the paper charts and navigation equipment. For centuries, paper charts were the only way to navigate in the open seas. Every captain, every vessel, and every crew had a stack of nautical maps, compasses, rulers, and pencils to plot their course. But as you have seen before, back in the day, navigating with these older types of equipment required way more skills than it does today. Just to navigate with paper charts required skill, so you had to calculate distances accurately, factor in currents, and constantly update your position. It makes you understand why, when digital navigation came, suddenly plotting courses turned as easy as tapping a screen, and nobody wanted to stick to the old ways anymore. GPS chart plotters, electronic maps, and real-time tracking have made paper charts feel like ancient relics. They are still in use, and people say that they are not completely gone yet, since they can be a great backup in case of electronic failure. But let's be honest, most people can't even find their neighborhood Starbucks without using Google Maps, let alone find their way sailing across oceans. And if you do see someone unfolding a massive paper chart on their dashboard, they're either an old-school navigator or trying to find Blackbeard's hidden hoard. Pirates may be long gone, but some of their masteries live on. From old-school navigation tools to the crow's nest watch system and even the wooden telescope, history is full of relics that are not going to be easily forgotten. Imagining sailors relying only on the position of the stars to cross over to the New World, merchants using paper charts to make their way to the West Indies, and gondoliers gliding across the canals in Venice really makes you appreciate the evolution of technology. Now we have GPS, radars, high-tech stabilizers, and much, much more. So what do you think? Should some of these forgotten maritime tools make a comeback, or are we better off with modern tech? And if you could hunt for one lost pirate treasure, which would it be? Leave a comment below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep dives into history and adventure.